with our wonderful guest speaker. Welcome to today's event hosted by the Trauma Interest Working Group, which is the event today is focused on addressing inequality with the next generation of community schools. My name is Lisa Rosen. I'm Senior Assistant Instructional Professor and Associate Director of the Committee on Education at the University of Chicago. As it happens, I also am co-author of a book called The Ambitious Elementary School, which is about reducing inequality in academic achievement, focused on a set of schools on the south side of Chicago run by the University of Chicago. It's the University of Chicago Charter School. And there are many resonant themes between the argument that we advocate in our book and what our guest speaker, Dr. Winthrop, will be talking about today. So I'm excited about the conversation. Before I introduce our speaker, we're going to take a quick poll to see who is here today. If you haven't voted yet, you have about 20 seconds. Diana, I'll let you decide when you want to end that poll. There we go. It looks like we have a nice mix of staff, faculty, students, parent, and community representation. That's wonderful. Great. Happy to see such a diverse group here. So before we proceed, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the organization that is hosting this event. That is the Trauma Interest Working Group, or TWIG, which promotes the scientific interdisciplinary understanding of trauma to improve health equity on the south side of Chicago and beyond. TWIG does this through education, scholarship, clinical care, community service, and advocacy. The Trauma Interest Working Group is supported by the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation at the University of Chicago. And today's event is the third in a speaker series on schools, stress, and the pandemic. If you'd like to participate in future TWIG activities, there's instructions to sign up for the group listserv on this slide, and those will also be dropped into the chat. Please note that the event today will be recorded and video will be available on Mansueto's YouTube channel afterward. Our speaker today is Rebecca Winthrop, who is a senior fellow and co-director of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Winthrop's research focuses on education globally, with special attention to the skills young people need to thrive in work, life, and as constructive citizens. Dr. Winthrop works to promote quality and relevant education, including exploring how education innovations can leapfrog progress, particularly for the most marginalized youth. Our agenda today is Dr. Winthrop will speak for about 30 minutes, after which I'll pose a few questions to her, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. However, she has kindly agreed to be interrupted and to take questions throughout the presentation. So if you have questions during the presentation, don't hesitate to ask them. If you prefer to drop them in the chat, I can direct Dr. Winthrop's attention to them. Sometimes when you're speaking and sharing slides, you can't see the chat, so I will point those out. Or you can just speak up if you're comfortable doing so. So without further ado, let's turn the floor over to Dr. Winthrop. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Sonia, for the invite. I just wanted to say it's really nice to be here with all of you on a Friday, for me, afternoon. And thanks for joining. I thought I would do two things, really. First, I'll share a little bit about the Brookings Institution and our center and what we do, because you guys might not know, and it will help frame a little bit the second thing I want to do, which is share with you the findings from this Brookings Task Force on Next Generation Community Schools. And it will give you a little bit of a context for what the heck is a Brookings Task Force. So I am going to share my slides. Bear with me for one moment as I walk through that share. And let's see, I think I have to go to this. Does everybody see that? Okay, we're good. So just quickly about the center. So Brookings is a little bit like a university. I feel like I feel somewhat akin. We are a .edu, actually. It kind of feels like being a professor at a university, but you don't have any students, and policymakers are your students. I'm not sure that's the exact right analogy, but that's a little bit what it feels like. And hence we too have our share of silos. You guys are very interdisciplinary and cross-cutting, so you're kind of on the cutting edge, as I understand the Committee of Education and the Trauma Interest Working Group. But we have different departments, different programs, and my center sits in the Global Economy and Development Program. And we are focused on education, early childhood, K through 12, youth training, et cetera, some higher education, although not a lot, I must confess. We don't have a lot of experts in the higher ed area. And global economy and development is because this is really the center that looks at lessons from around the world. So we certainly do research and work in the US, and the task force work that I'll share with you today is US based. And every time somebody asks me, but why is it focused on, why are you sitting in global economy and development? And I say, well, the US is part of the rest of the world. So that's where we sit. This is a bit about how Brookings goes about its work. We like to think of our work as having three main goals usually. One is agenda setting, which is really this idea: if a topic is not on the policy agenda, it's not being covered, it's not being discussed, it's not being debated, and you think it's really important, it should get on there, you're doing agenda setting work, which looks different, can be more long-term than other type of work. If you feel that there is a topic you care a lot about that's really important and you need to, that's being debated, but a whole body of evidence isn't being used, or isn't being thought about, or isn't entering in the discussion, and you think it's really important that it does, and it will shape the outcome of the policy debate, then we talk about that as debate framing. And then if you feel like topics on the agenda, the debate is happening the right way, but really the big sort of sticking point is, well, how do we go about designing this and implementing it? And that's really sort of the policy designing piece. Sometimes we have projects that are multi-year and go from agenda setting to debate framing to policy designing. Sometimes we sort of plunk ourselves down on one or the other. But that's sort of the flavor of work we do. And because of that, some of our research is primary research, and some of our research is translational research, meaning we're scooping up research that people like yourselves, University of Chicago faculty, and many others around the world have done. It might be sitting in the academic literature, and putting it together and putting it in a format that's easily accessible by policymakers. We have heavily relied on translational research for the task force work, which I will show you in a minute. A little bit about our mission as a center, one of several centers at Brookings. We focus on accelerating education change to equip all children and youth in a rapidly changing world. We have a huge focus on equity, but also on this idea of a breadth of competencies and skills, academic plus 21st century, whole child development, however you want to use terms, whatever terms you want to use, and every jurisdiction has a different term they use for that concept. In terms of our research areas, I was trying to figure out what would be the best thing to focus on for all of you. And I picked the task force work because I think it's most readily applicable to your topic, but I'll just share with you a little bit about the different initiatives that we have at the center. One is really around promoting innovation to accelerate learning. This is where the partly where the task force work sits. We've done a lot of work looking at education innovations around the world and comparing them to, just because it's innovative doesn't mean it's good or useful, but what could be helpful in helping develop whole child development in a way that closes equity gaps. We have a team that looks at scaling, which is a lot of process. How do you scale? With the knowledge that there's lots of wonderful pilots, small scale successes in education all around the world, but getting wholesale change is a whole other matter. We also look at this idea of preparing individuals for a rapidly changing world, which can include a wide range of things. And we have a sort of 21st century competence portfolio, and then ensuring no one is left behind, which cuts across all of them, but we have particular focus on girls' education, which is a developing world focus, sub-Saharan Africa, Southwest Asia, in particular, where there's large girls' education needs, a focus on early childhood as a leveling of the playing field for communities and families and young people, especially who are very marginalized, chronic poverty situations, et cetera. So that's sort of the flavor of the different type of work we do. In terms of our levers, what is it we actually do? How do we get stuff done? We do quite a bit of research, which is the building evidence. It always starts there. And then we often translate that research into what we call decision maker friendly tools. So decision makers can absorb it, use it, act on it. We do quite a bit of capacity strengthening. It's sort of a buzzword, but it's basically any advice, guidance, support that a decision maker would need to help them act on some of the recommendations that we might have put forth. And then we do quite a bit of what we call engaging actors. I tend to call it movement building, which is not really a Brookings terms, but it's really about the sort of spotlighting, convening groups, influencing public discourse, et cetera. So those are kind of our levers. We do not implement directly. We work with those who do, but we do not ourselves. And so that's the first part. And I want to switch now that you have a little sense of what we do at Brookings to tell you a little bit about this task force work. What I wanted to do was, I had a couple of things. I wanted to tell you how the task force came about, sort of where the genesis was on our end, tell you a little bit about what a community school is, in case you don't know. Some of you may be very well versed, and then go through some of the key findings and recommendations in the task force, and then we can stop. And as Lisa said, please feel free to, and Lisa's right, I can't see the chat box. So flag for me, Lisa,
Yes.
if there's questions, I'm happy to take them as we go along. So the task force and how it came about, and then who they are. I had done work on this idea of leapfrogging or harnessing innovations to accelerate the pace of change for several years. And one of the things we did is develop something called a leapfrog pathway, which was both a combination of looking at the literature around what it takes to transform education systems so you can get whole child development outcomes, or academic plus 21st century outcomes, or breadth of skills, which is often referred to in other countries, outcomes, and a combination of horizon scanning of schools, nonprofits, creative programs around 150 countries that were trying to do that work, and seeing what they were able to do. And in part, we married the two. And the reason we did that is because a lot of the academic literature takes a while to catch up to the pace of innovation that exists in practice. And we wanted to capture both. And so that part of what that leapfrog pathway was saying, if you are a jurisdiction or you're a nonprofit organization working in education, or you're a funder even investing in education, what are the things you could do to try to accelerate the pace of change so it closes the equity gap against not just academic competence, but academic and 21st century skills. And a piece of what was in that leapfrog pathway was this idea of really harnessing education allies in and around schools. That could be parents, family members, communities, it could be museums, it could be parks, it could be local nonprofits, it could be health centers. We found actually that there were many, many organizations in small sort of pockets of the world doing just that. And that in some ways that was a quick way to bring in more muscle meat relevance to student learning. And when COVID hit, of course, everybody, this idea of education allies in the community pairing and partnering with schools was all of a sudden not just on the margins. One thing I should say is in that work on leapfrogging inequality and that work on harnessing education innovations, we found very few examples, and I'm happy to give some examples prior to COVID that were large scale, or rather I should say system-wide. There was actually lots of examples that were large scale, as in they did go across many countries, but they only tackled sort of a slice, sort of learning to read, et cetera, versus an entire system really having a new approach. And so because of COVID, all of a sudden innovation is in the center of education systems. So there is in our policy world this discourse that goes something like, education is so hard to change. Why should we fund it or invest in it if you're a funder or a minister of finance or something? Because it's not innovative and it's hard to move things quickly. And to me, one of the things that with all its awful things it's done in the world that COVID has showed is that when push comes to shove, education systems can innovate. They can, and they did. I mean, everybody just did. It might not be the direction we want them to innovate because it was forced from a pandemic, and it's certainly not a policy prescription to say, have a global crisis and therefore education systems can innovate. That's not an answer, but it does demonstrate that you can do new things. And so in the summer of 2020, we were in the throes of really advising lots of decision makers and policymakers and education actors around the world about how to pivot and what to do amid COVID. And one of the things we decided to put out was a bit of a vision. And we put out a piece called, I believe it was called, I should know this, I co-authored it with my co-director, Emiliana Vegas, Beyond Reopening Schools, How Can Education Emerge Stronger Than Before COVID-19? And the idea was everybody is so heads down, just dealing with day-to-day decisions. I mean, running a school is the number of decisions on a good day without a pandemic that you have to do to just get the logistics of running a school down is mind-boggling. And it was completely overwhelming. And we said, look, what we think is important from looking at past emergencies around the world and how education systems have dealt with it is to be sure to have a little bit of a medium-term vision and see out ahead, 6 months about are there things that we're doing now in the crisis that actually we should sustain after the crisis finishes? So there's a lot of talk about Build Back Better. There's a lot of talk about, education transformation out of the crisis. So we were trying to put some meat on the bones to that idea. And one of the things that we said was that we found actually in a little bit of a survey, global survey, and not in a formal sense, but case studies we did, was that new forms of family and parent engagement that COVID has unleashed, many jurisdiction leaders were saying they wanted to reserve and maintain part of that new relationship. Of course, you don't want parents to be teachers. There's many things we don't want to continue, but there were some things they found were really helpful and interesting. And a lot of it had to do with a closer collaboration with families and communities and new forms of communication and a new focus oriented towards helping kids learn. And we know from lots of literature that family and parent engagement in education, if particularly focused on supporting kids learning at home, less than not necessarily about, parents come to the school play, which is nice, but doesn't necessarily help kids in their attainment or outcomes, can be very helpful, especially for marginalized kids. So that was an idea that we were putting out there. And then through collaboration with representatives from 22 organizations in the US who were very focused and have been for decades on the community schools approach, we developed this task force, really with the idea that community schools, when I'll tell you what I mean by that in a minute, were across the board. Well, I don't know, across the board, I don't know enough to say that, but by most accounts, community schools fared very well in the pandemic relative to those who weren't, because they already had connections with families, parents, communities, and they already had the partnership models to help make sure their students got whatever it was that they needed, which could be a range of things. So that's sort of the genesis part of the task force. And the reason and the rationale for why the task force was that a massive increase in inequality, as you know well, community schools being one of the approaches that seem to fare very well and be quite timely and relevant to meet the needs of kids in the US, and that they should be scaled. And that was sort of the main motivation for forming the task force and coming together with a collective voice. So, whoops, why did we get involved? I just went through that. Okay, what is a next generation community schools? This was a debate in the task force. It is a debate in the field community schools movement, but people cohered around this idea, which really originated out of the Learning Policy Institute with Linda Darling-Hammond and Jeannie Oakes and many others, but in particular, they've contributed heavily and were on the task force that there are 4 pillars. Community schools are 4 pillars. It's just because you can't sort of slap a name on your school and say community school and then be a community school. It doesn't work that way. You have to, at a minimum, sort of attend to these 4 pillars. One is expanded and enriched learning time, which talks about out of school time, but also talks about the fabric of the community being a canvas for which teaching and learning can take place for students, much more applied learning, experiential learning, etc. Active family and community engagement, which is with the flavor of being cooperative and co-creative, and really sharing, maybe not equally, but certainly sharing design of what helps children learn, etc. Integrated student supports, which is sometimes referred to as wraparound services. And this is the coordination of social supports, whether they're health or dental or mental health or what have you, that kids need to be safe and to be healthy so that they can learn, and using the school as a site to make sure kids get those. And then the 4th pillar is this idea of collaborative leadership practices at the school level. It's a governance idea where many community schools have something called a community school coordinator, and it can be called different things, that really has a role in helping to make sure these partnerships and relationships happen. Because one of the things that doesn't seem to work is to say, we want to be a community school, let's just go out and partner and not have clear responsibilities for who is going to actually be responsible for developing those relationships. Because it is this approach is heavily relationship intensive. So that's what we mean by community school. In the task force report, it's clear, and we tried to really emphasize, and it was very important to task force members to emphasize that the community, next generation community school mindset is one that is asset-based and very culturally grounded with the community's members around them. And we had debates over language, from learning loss to lost instructional time, which, you know, words matter, and it is actually quite significant with lost instructional time, meaning the onus is really on the system to serve the kids, and learning loss perhaps connoting that it's the student's fault for being behind. So that is what the task force sort of cohered around in terms of what a next generation community school is. One thing I wanted to mention is, and in the task force report, we go through the evidence for the community school model. But what I wanted to mention is something that we also discussed and tried to make clear in the task force, although it wasn't sort of a top line message, which is we're talking about a next generation of community schools because, and that's different from just a community school. That was one of the questions we get, you know, what's the difference between a community school and a next generation community school? And the main push, and almost every single task force member heavily pushed this, was that you must include teaching and learning at the center of this approach. And that there has been a little bit of, that has always been part of the community schools model, but it hasn't been attended to as an equal level of emphasis as the active family and community engagement and the integrated supports and the collaborative governance. So the next generation community schools is really one that we're saying must have that attention to teaching and learning. So that is the approach. Then, you guys will like this one. Then we had this question of, well, okay, how are we going to recommend scaling this approach? And everyone agreed on the task force, and I'll walk through all these little blue dots and the light blue data there, but everyone on the task force agreed. And if we are serious about next generation community schools being, you know, ready to meet the moment of education inequality, you have to take a progressive universalism approach to scaling, meaning you have to support with resources, energy, effort, money, community schools approach to go to those parts of the US where kids have the highest needs. We would not feel successful as a task force if there was a scaling attempt nationally to scale the model, and it really went to sort of middle or upper middle income communities first. So one of the things we did, and we did this together with Bob Balfance at Johns Hopkins, and he was on the task force and has done quite a bit of work on this topic, is to try to figure out where one should start with this progressive universalism approach. And we developed something called a district locator tool. And I'll tell you what it is. This is the headline here, and I'll show you the criteria in the next slide. Basically, what we found was that if you could focus on just 4% of school districts, and those are the districts highlighted in the blue, which is very hard to see in this tiny map, but they're basically districts in almost every state in the US. And they are urban districts, but they're also sort of smaller towns. Some of the districts have, you know, rural communities. So they're diverse. If you focused on these 4% of districts, you would reach 40% of all the students in the country. And you would reach, and those kids are very high concentrations of the kids with the highest unmet needs. And I'm going to tell you what we mean by unmet needs in a minute, but I want to make a note on the map. It looks like from this map, and I must say we played and played around with our wonderful graphic designer to figure out how to do this. We couldn't figure it out. It looks like they're all sitting in Florida. But what we have done is highlight the districts and the places where there's big blue spaces on this tiny map. It looks a little bit better in the report, which is big. You know, the page layout is bigger. States that have large geographic districts come out looking like all the kids are in Florida. So they're not all in Florida. It's just that Florida has large geographically large school districts. And so it's not, I don't know what to do about this map. We thought it was important to show. If anybody has a better idea of how to visualize this, I'm all ears. But the thing that was a huge surprise to us, I mean, I wouldn't say that. Let me retrace. It was, I mean, it's awful. It's absolutely morally awful that you could just focus on 4% of the school districts and get such a high percentage of the kids who are marginalized in this country. It's awful in terms of what it says about educational equity in our country. But at the same time, from a policymaker perspective, from a scaling perspective, from a resourcing perspective, this is good news, because it means you don't have to go and boil the ocean and go to every single state and every single community. You could actually help a lot of kids, and the kids who are farthest behind and most need the help, by focusing on a few geographical locations. So this is, I wanted to show you what we meant, or how, not what we meant. This is how we picked who were the districts that were on the map. So one was, we looked at districts who had very large numbers of students who do not graduate high school. We looked at districts who had large numbers of Black and Latina students who do not graduate high school. We looked at districts who had very high levels of poverty, and where there was chronic absenteeism of 30% or more, which, as I'm sure you all know, affects not only the kids who are absent, but the entire sort of functioning and ethos and culture of the school. It's very damaging. We looked for districts where half of the children lived in a neighborhood with high concentrations of poverty, 40% plus poverty rate. And that was all data that we pulled from before the pandemic. So these numbers might have been, are more exaggerated now. We just didn't have the data sets but it was very important for us to say unmet need is both prior legacies of educational inequity and hard hit by COVID. And you put those together because I think that's obvious why we wanted to do that. And then we looked for districts that had higher than average death rates from COVID. And once you sorted all of that out, there were 466 districts. So that's how we got to the 4%. So that was one major finding. Another sort of big recommendation coming out of the task force was that although you want to take a progressive universalism approach, really, we believe that all schools should be community schools. And in the report, we go through sort of the sets of evidence and some examples and some cases as to why that is. And you can see the reasons there in this little chart around centers on equity, improves teaching and learning, shares leadership with the community, partners with families, creates a culture of connectedness, accelerates post-secondary success, and can serve as incubates innovation. But the reason why we thought this was really important to include is we did not want to have a community school approach or a next generation community school approach be seen as just something that you do for poor kids. And in terms of policy, momentum, uptake, interest, it's really important to show why there is broad interest in this type of an approach. And so that was one, that's a strategic sort of scaling insight, but also the evidence bears that out, that this is just a better way of doing school for every kid. It's particularly helpful for those kids who are in those 4% of districts, or another way of saying it, those kids who are the most marginalized, who have the least opportunities. It's incredibly helpful for those kids. But this is actually an approach that every kid would flourish in. And being connected to the community, having teaching and learning in and out of school, applying learning, having sort of the supports and help you need for your health and well-being as you go through your learning trajectory. These are all things that all kids would benefit from. So that was sort of another big recommendation. And it's why we sort of, our tagline was really, communities, next generation community schools can meet the moment to address education inequality, which was heavily about that 4%, and about the evidence base, which really shows the strength, which is, I would say, the evidence base is the strongest for community schools around integrated supports, parent-family engagement, and collaborative governance. It is less strong because they've done it less, community schools, around the teaching and learning piece. And so we frame it as, community schools meet the moment to address education inequality and can lay the foundation for education transformation. And we certainly believe, and there's plenty of evidence in the report, that the type of teaching and learning approach that community schools are doing is really a much better way of teaching and learning. Lisa can weigh in on that. And it's just that it hasn't been as rigorously evaluated yet in the community school model itself. So, Lisa, I think maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, we have about 20 minutes.
Yep,
and
I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, so we did have a couple of questions that were sent to me. People sent to me privately and one publicly, and I have a few of my own, but people should also feel free to speak up or drop a question in the chat. One participant, Dwayne Davis, wrote to everyone to ask whether education inequality and the kind of inequality you're talking about reducing, are you talking about addressing the systems of schooling that are attached to the way communities and society is inequitable? For example, families need mental health care and wellness. Students usually get that from schools, but only at a certain tier, if they meet certain criteria. Post-pandemic, we're going to need new ratios of care workers and social workers and so forth, to address the stress and trauma that all young people have experienced. One social worker counselor per 50 kids is what Dwayne was suggesting, which is a very big difference from what the ratios are now. So, what do you think about that? We have other questions too, but that's first.
I think it's a really good question, and I don't think we really have an answer, to be totally honest, to Dwayne. If I'm interpreting the question right, which I'm not entirely sure I am, I think what we are saying is that the community school approach, it's not the only approach out there, by the way, to address education inequality, but it's a really, really good one for the moment we're in. And it's proven itself in the pandemic because it provides integrated wraparound supports. But we are not, in the task force report, recommending, we don't go outside of the strategies that schools should draw down on and look at sort of like, how would you help mental health, depression, loneliness, these are rampant, and not only adolescents, but families and adults in many communities. How would you help address that, which would necessarily probably uplift families and hence students? I think that's what Dwayne was angling at, and we don't go that far.
So I think a related follow-up question that he asked was, how do we unlock federal dollars through policy to support this concept nationally, because of course, this is a very resource intensive model. And, you know, in cities, Dwayne says in cities where coordinators are community organizers and workers, they're effective through their own efficacy, or if they have a relationship with a principal and who knows how to deploy these resources. You know, it's very much dependent on the social networks and the entrepreneurial skills that local leaders may or may not have. But this, you know, our school systems are very decentralized. There's not targeted funds for this. You know, how do you think about advocating for, as Dwayne says, unlocking federal dollars through policy?
Yeah. I didn't go, it's a great question. And it is one that the task force, it's an argument that the task force members felt was an argument pro scaling a community schools model, because it can draw down on multiple streams, including from health and mental health, et cetera, social services protection, to deliver services in schools. And so unlike other education approaches that might, you know, do equally well by kids, this one has a bit broader of a funding base to draw from. And there's lots of detailed recommendations in the task force around braided funding and things like that from the federal level. But the task force also made sure not to just focus on the national level, because obviously there's limits to what the federal government can do in education. So heavily focused on states and cities, mayors also.
I have my own questions, but
Yeah.
I want to make sure that there's opportunity for our audience to ask theirs. So the floor is open. Please just speak up or put your question in the chat. All right, I'll ask my questions while people ponder theirs.
Sure.
Well, so, you know, many people have argued that schools have been asked to do too much. And, you know, Doug Downey has been arguing this recently in his work with Condren, that has also been arguing that the focus on schools as the source of social inequality among academic sociologists and critical theorists has actually directed attention away from other social safety net policies that might be equally effective at reducing inequality in academic achievement, you know, things related to food security and basic income, housing,
employment,
et cetera. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I know you talked about this a little bit, but I wonder how the folks in the community schools movement that you're talking with are maybe allying with others who are advocating for social safety, you know, larger social safety net kinds of policies, maybe even within Brookings, so that there is a coordinated effort to prevent this from becoming just another way to put all of the burden on schools for solving social problems they didn't create.
Yeah. The education as panacea. I have a colleague at the University of Minnesota named Fran Vavris who talks about education as the panacea, which is a problem in the policy debate. But I'll share with you my perspectives, and I'll share with you a little bit of my insight on the debate, on that debate. So first on the debate, we had a broad-based task force. People have been working on community schools and helping build the movement and the model and the approach for decades. And some of them are social welfare organizations like Children's Aid Society, and some of them are teacher unions like National Education Association, right? So you have a whole bunch of different people who take this approach from a different angle. There are those who I think philosophically, because we actually had this debate in the task force, I think philosophically people would agree that, well, a couple of things. Like, if we want to really transform education, we should think about transforming communities and society, because education often reflects the inequities that exist in society, right? You take a critical theory approach. And on the other side, if we want to really think about helping communities, we should invest in social services. And at the end of the day, and I subscribe to this, to be honest. I see the perspective, but I subscribe to this, are pragmatists, because we want to actually get stuff done with existing federal dollars that might be coming down the pike. And we want busy decision makers to take action quickly, like really quickly. And so we decided that it's just much more pragmatic to think about how to support a community schools approach. Now, I don't think you need a community schools approach, or rather all the pieces. Like, you don't need integrated services and necessarily community schools approach in a country that has much better social safety nets. But are we going to get much better social safety nets in the next 12 months, 24 months? Radically transform soup to nuts? Probably not. I mean, I hate to say it, but probably not. So at least this is the pragmatic approach. Like, let's do something now. So that debate was had, and I think everybody on the task force is very focused on I'm very focused on the huge looming crisis of inequity that's coming out of the pandemic, and what we can do practically. So that, I think that would be my response. On the education as panacea side, I wouldn't put any of this on the task force. It's just my own reflection. I really came out of I'm coming out of this pandemic as I was always very, very supportive of public education, but have looked at innovations and different, I always felt the government has the duty, but doesn't necessarily have to implement. And there's many different ways to help kids get educated. But I've come out really feeling that in a lot of countries, institutions matter and schools matter. And in fact, we should go the other way, and we should just beef up our schools big time, or at least in societies with large inequities. We should. I mean, the schools were the ones who were like the food banks. It's crazy. So, like, let's support them to do that work, and do it well, rather than saying, here, you're trained as a science teacher, now go be a social worker. So that's where
more social workers in schools.
Right. Yeah.
All right, we have a question in the chat from Royce Lee, who asks if there are examples of community school programs that have been helpful with respect to violence prevention.
Yes, I'm sure they are. And I'm trying to think if there's cases in the task force. They're probably in the report, and there probably is, and I can't quite remember. I'm sure there are, but I don't have them on the top of my head.
Certainly the University of Chicago has its own Center for Community Violence Prevention that does work in schools. I don't know if is anybody here from that center? Dwayne, if you're listening, maybe you know the director, right? But we do. Royce, I assume you're familiar with their work? Yeah. But I don't, I know they've been doing some research on interventions, but as I understand it, they're trying to intervene in the context of conventionally organized schools as an add-on intervention, not in the context of schools that are organized as a community school, which is a different context, right?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. Hi, everyone. Dwayne Davis. Thank you, Rebecca, for your work and presentation. Yeah, so the Center for Youth Violence Prevention here works with a major community organization to grab the data from the families and acts like a go-between between the schools, a convener and a go-between between the schools and the community partners to help them organize, gather information, and then be strategic about how they move forward. And that's one kind of large aspect of what they do. And they present that information out to the geographic community to say, here's what young people are saying. about how they feel about their school, how they feel about their community. So then they can have conversations about those interventions. So it kind of functions a little bit in the same way that a coordinator would in a school. It just
Sounds like
convenes
it.
a larger group in the same way.
Thank you. I have a question, Rebecca. In your conversation, I assume you've been going around kind of presenting your recommendations and starting to talk with decision makers, especially people with authority over budgets. And I'm interested to know what kind of reaction you're getting, you know, how in your conversations with policymakers, how much appetite is for this, is there for this idea, which has implications for, you know, requires local tax funding. You know, of course, there's many funding streams, as we were saying, but, you know, in a time of economic crisis, you know, what kind of appetite is there, and political will is there for this?
Well, the report was launched last week, so we haven't, so it's very new. So we will go out and do that. One of the things that I can tell you is that there was large interest before we did the report. We did the task force did an open letter to the Biden-Harris administration during the transition. And there was quite a bit of interest at that point. And it also made its way, community funding of community schools approach made its way into Biden's original COVID relief package, saying that funding that's going to be going to the states and districts and stuff should, you know, make sure to build upon and expand community schools. Now, you look to this community schools model, because the worry of many task force members is that that money could be frittered away in things that aren't actually that effective, or that benefit more those who are, you know, the middle class versus those who really, really need it. Unfortunately, the House, it was like last week while we were launching the report, the House took out that language in the bill. So I don't think it's in there. So I'm not tracking it super closely, but some of the task force members are. And I think we're going to have to sort of do a multi-pronged strategy, one with the education secretary and with the new Secretary Cardona. And I've sent the report off to his office. And two, really, again, this is why we did this district locator stuff. Try to reach out to those jurisdiction leaders who have lots of kids who need a lot of help, and say, hey, here's an idea. Here's something that could be worthwhile. And we have a whole bunch of task force members who could share and assist. There's a couple of school districts, Oakland Unified School District is one, that are our community school district. That's their entire approach to equity across the district. So there's great examples. New Mexico has a sort of bill up in the state legislature around community schools and has the 4 pillars in it. So there's great pockets of stuff happening, and it's more about connecting them to the places that really need help. Now, clearly, no report and no federal government can go to a community on the ground and say, you will be a community school. Like, it has to be up to, and there has to be quite a bit of dialogue and discussion with the community itself. So, you know, the idea, I think, from the task force is to really try to get those early adopters in those districts, and, you know, to see if they can start using the approach, and how the network we have can help them in doing that.
Would you envision this occurring in a manner analogous to something like Race for the Top, where states could apply for funds dedicated to this in some kind of competitive way, you know, given how decentralized we are?
Yeah, that's beyond my pay grade. I think that we would encourage Secretary Cardona, and there's various detailed suggestions, which I spared you guys the slide in the report, of very sort of specific things that could be done. But basically, that there should be a strategy figured out at the federal level about how best to support districts who need it most.
Right. So
maybe it's an incentive structure, maybe it's a technical support structure, you know.
I see. So you don't recommend a specific strategy, you just recommend that they have a strategy.
There's a bunch of strategies in there, but it's
Okay.
more about funding. It's more like scaling AmeriCorps. It's like there's a lot in there of things that the federal government can do, but also states and mayors. But we're not designing the policy
Mhm, mhm.
for the Secretary of Education yet. Not yet.
Dwayne, who is full of questions, asks, how does this play out in states where governors support vouchers or align with the previous Secretary of Education?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a very good question. And again, that's why we said federal government, states and mayors. Like, I think we're really focused on like those 466 districts. And by the way, you could make it 600 districts if you just tweak, your categories, your criteria for inclusion. We're not saying it's only those 466, but the illustration is in a small number of places, you can help a huge number of kids. It would make a huge difference. So we'll see how it goes. I don't know. Stay tuned. It might be jurisdiction by jurisdiction, superintendent by superintendent, and then, conference on mayors. Like when we do this policy work, one never knows. You can strategize all you want where you think things are going to get taken up or get traction, but you have to be a bit opportunistic and see how it goes. And since we're right at the beginning, I'm not sure, but I don't have super high hopes, Dwayne, in terms of traction for what you say, but who knows? Maybe I'm totally wrong. There is quite a, bit of interest in community ownership
Right.
across the board.
We have a new administration, a new focus nationally on equity. I think that, if ever there was a time when this idea was going to take root and be taken up, now is the time, which is what you've said. So I want to acknowledge that we're at 1 o'clock and thank our speaker, thank everybody for attending. And I guess we're done. Is that right, Diana?
Yep, that's right. And echoing thanks so much, Rebecca, and to you as well, Lisa, for moderating. And just to note to everyone that the next instance in the speaker series will be in early to mid-April. So please stay tuned for notice about that next talk. But for now, take care and enjoy the weekend.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye,
Download the
everybody.
report. Share it with your mayors. You guys will be the ones to launch it. All right. Take care.